All right, let's get to the main event. Let me take a moment to thank our sponsor for this program, New Hampshire Humanities. New Hampshire Humanities is an independent nonprofit and their work is statewide, but it's not a state agency. Their grants and programs support local organizations like the library. Each year, New Hampshire Humanities sponsor more than 650 educational and cultural programs all over the state. At the end of the program, I will post a link to the survey, which we really appreciate you filling out. And I'd like to introduce Rebecca Noel, Professor of History at Plymouth State University. She has a master's and a PhD in American and New England Studies from Boston University and a bachelor's in history from Yale. She teaches history courses on the antebellum and Civil War era, American medicine, childhood, and the American West. Her book in progress is Save Our Scholars, The Quest for Health in American Schools. Thank you, Rebecca. The floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Holly. I'm so thrilled to see all of you. This is really fun. And you know, I got to hand it to Zoom. It really makes these talks so much easier. You don't have to go out in the cold, dark night, and people can attend from all kinds of places. It's actually been a great thing. So I'm going to show you a presentation. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and I will be clicking through this. And I agree with the person who said that there is no Q&A. So I don't know why, but that's okay. The chat works fine, and we can just use the chat. So at the end, I'll be happy to take questions, but I'm also, as I said a little bit earlier as we were chatting, I'll be also happy to take gym class stories because almost everybody has a gym class story. So I'm really looking forward to that, whether it's a happy story or not a happy story. So this is a talk I've done before called The History of Gym Class. As Holly explained, I teach at Plymouth State University, and I'm very grateful to be here with you tonight. So as she said, this program is made possible by New Hampshire Humanities, and they do such a good job of setting these talks up. So people have different thoughts about gym class. Some people, it's their favorite. I think this girl maybe loved it. This one, maybe not so much. And I have always found it a pretty interesting phenomenon, gym class. And I became interested in why we have it. Like, why did schools start doing it? Why did schooling's mission go from what we see expressed in this architecture on the left? This is the Eureka Schoolhouse in Springfield, Vermont, built in 1785, rebuilt since, but on the original footprint. A very humble building. Probably these windows were smaller in 1785, as a matter of fact, but not much of a, not much of a physical plant. Why did we go from that sort of building to this gym in Lawrenceburg, Indiana? The gym itself cost $11 million, which is 4 times the national average. That's almost a 60,000 square foot facility for a high school. Why? I just find this very interesting. So I'm going to give you the answer, and then we can all go home. Just kidding. I'm going to give you the short answer, and then I'll explain how we get there. The answer is that American educators, by around 1830, if not sooner, believed that school makes people sick. And they weren't just worried about school. They were worried about any sort of sedentary, scholarly type of lifestyle. And this is actually relevant to us today, as you can probably all immediately see. People spend time on Zoom, people spend time homeschooling their children, people are living on their computers, we all spend a lot of time indoors, living on screens. So we're all living kind of like scholars. And their dilemma about schooling making people sick is basically our dilemma as well. So what we're going to do tonight is look at the backstory of a problem that is with us still today. So we see this in the news all the time, and I just brought in a few real headlines from real newspapers online to share with you that might sound familiar. Your chair is killing you, the hazards of the couch, dangers of your desk job, sitting is the new smoking. We've probably seen these and more. And there's one that bugged me in particular. You can't outrun the health effects of your desk job. Unfortunately, I ran a marathon before I figured that out. So this sounds like a modern problem, but it goes way, way back. So I'm going to go back and show you some of the deeper roots of this concern about the scholarly life. It might seem kind of obvious, but it's actually got a particular history to it, and we're going to trace that. I've got 5 parts to this talk. The first one is the longest, and then they get shorter and shorter. So the roots of the idea, I'll take them right up to about 1800, then, and that'll be in Europe mostly. Then we'll come over to the US and talk about schooling, because when we're talking about adults, it's really quite similar talking about school children. Then we'll talk about sport culture kind of outside of school, sport culture inside of school, and yet there's a difference between having sports and having fitness. And then we'll talk about what we're going to do about it today. So here's some background to the idea that the scholarly life in a few different forms makes people sick. You can see it way back in Plato's writing many, many years ago. The way, whoops, sorry, gotta go back to sharing. A little glitch there. Where are you, Plato? There he is. So he said in 360 BC, when the mind applies itself too ardently to learning and research, it completely enervates and destroys the body. When it teaches or debates, it overheats and enfeebles the body. And back in Plato's day, if not even a little bit earlier, they had a very highly developed, not only sport culture, but physical education culture. They had complicated athletic life. They had gyms, they had gym teachers all the way back in Plato's times, both the Athenians and the Spartans, somewhat different PE cultures, way, way back then. But then it kind of died down. And for a long, long time, a millennium, there were a lot of scholars and not a lot of athletes. Who were the scholars at that time? People who were religious personnel, like in monasteries and convents, ministers, priests, monks. Starting in the 1200s in Europe, there were universities. And so that's a whole new wave of people living a scholarly life. Also, people who were magistrates, scribes, notaries. You need a lot of scribes before the printing press. Even after the printing press was invented, you still need a lot of scribes. And all of those people spend their whole life sitting at a desk and writing. At this time, too, a lot of church leaders in the Christian denominations looked down on exercise as something pretty unholy and not spiritual. So there wasn't a lot of spiritual incentive to exercise. So people already kind of knew that scholars were living an unhealthy lifestyle. It was too sedentary. They were sitting most of the time. They were inside all the time, reading and writing, talking, not exercising or hardly moving at all. So a number of scholars wrote about this starting in the 1400s. And I went through these texts, these books and pamphlets, and picked out kind of some choice quotes across these few centuries here. And then I'll just share them with you as like some highlights of what people thought about the unhealthy life that scholars were leading and what people could do better. So all of them thought the scholarly life made you sick. As Marsilio Ficino said, and he's the earliest one in 1480, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, shrinks the sinews. Samuel Tissot, a physician from Switzerland in 1768, said studious men are naturally weak and feeble. And they thought everybody agreed about this. Bernardino Ramazzini, a doctor in Italy in 1713, says a sedentary life has a bad reputation. This guy, Feijo, was from Spain. He was a priest. He's going to see it a little bit differently, but he said the universal idea is that the application to letters shortens the term of life. And Tissot again said it's an old complaint already by 1768 that study is hurtful to the body. So what specific harms were they worried about? Too much sitting again. And that led to everything in the intestinal and excretory tract being messed up. It led to gout. It led to bad posture, paleness, weakness, and just itchy skin. Don't think a standing desk is going to fix it. Already by the 1400s, people were trying out standing desks and really not doing any better. They had varicose veins. They had bad posture, even if they were standing. And Ramazzini in 1713 said, it's just as bad as sitting all day. And thinking, they were concerned about sort of the hydraulics of thinking in the brain. They thought that your limbs would swell up, blood would pool in your brain. It made you dizzy. It made you have a nosebleed if you had a big idea. And sometimes just your hair would just simply fall out. And here's an example that I saw in a few different sources. After 4 months of the closest study imaginable, this fellow, the Chevalier de Pernay's beard fell out, then his eyelashes, eyebrows, the hair of his head, and all his hair. They were also concerned about what we would probably call neurological symptoms and psychological symptoms. Frequent headaches, premature senility, as they would say it, the brain fiber just kind of ossified. Scholars were melancholy and anxious and usually pretty touchy, and sometimes even had hallucinations. So here's an example. There have been many instances of persons who thought themselves metamorphosed into lanterns and complained of having lost their thighs. One person wrote about a fellow named Gaspar Barlaas, who was an orator, a poet, a physician who studied too much, started thinking his body was made of butter, and so he had to stay away from the fire. And this had a terrible outcome. He jumped into a well. Specifically, scholars who did a lot of speaking, that is, priests, but also lawyers and also professors, would have their own problems in addition, problems with their throat and with their lungs and with coughing blood. You might think, oh, that's tuberculosis. I see what's coming. That's going to come, but not quite yet, not before about 1800. That link between scholarship and tuberculosis lies a little bit in the future. There were also what we would call sexual side effects that some people worried about, like Ficino, this priest both the priest and a physician in the 15th century. He said the sperm of scholars is weak, and so they rarely have successful sons. Nothing, he said, can be more noxious to the contemplator or investigator than the venereal act. And the way he put it was really pretty snippy. He said, let those who are going to have an active sex life consult other doctors. I have counseled those who are going to exercise their intelligence. Oh, okay. So scholars make it worse. It's not only built into their lifestyle, but they actually exacerbate it through choices they make. They don't bathe. They just lost in thought. They stop chewing in the middle of a bite. Their teeth get filthy and fall out, and they don't digest things well, and they work late. They're breathing in candle fumes. They just do everything wrong. And sometimes they even forget to go to the bathroom, which can just, as you might guess, be fatal. And everyone told stories about scholars who were just too absorbed in their work and ended up dying out of not using the privy. So what should they do? I bet you can guess. The top 3 recommendations. 1, exercise, exercise, and also exercise. So what kinds of exercise were recommended in these centuries ahead of the gym class that we're going to get to? Walking, of course, sailing, gymnastics, that's a special meaning of gymnastics, shuttlecock, we would call it badminton, horseback riding. Some people said carriage riding is really good for you, even though you're not doing the work. Just bracing yourself is what they call passive exercise, still is maybe isometric, I don't know exactly what we would call it, and travel in general for just the kind of stimulation of it. And skating was a popular one, but more among men. You may know this painting. It's quite a famous painting. It's in Edinburgh. And actually, we know that the fellow in the painting was a minister and loved to skate, but you wouldn't know it from the expression on his face. So a number of the writers that I'm quoting said that friends should stop each other from studying too much. For example, Dr. Tissot said, be vigilant, knock at their doors, get them out of their study, even if they don't want to, make them go outside and take a walk. But Tissot said, oh, sorry, I'll come back to Tissot. Also, it does matter what you eat. So they worried about people eating too many different things. Keep it simple, not too many different foods, keep them soft, keep them lightweight, like boiled meat and soft boiled eggs and bread. If you eat something too heavy, it brings what they call drowsy lumpishness. They explained this. Grattarolo in the 1500s said, vapors rise to your brain when you eat things that are, too, I guess, aromatic, lentils, leeks, garlic, even eels. So be careful, not too many eels. And another dietary problem has also got a sexual side effect. Grattarolo said, don't eat sparrows. They're way too stimulating for a scholar who's going to be frail. Keep the sparrows for old men that have young wives. And they also recommended a few things that just make me think about how hooked in the global economy was already to some of this advice in 1555. Grattarolo recommended tobacco. This is before people are growing tobacco in Jamestown. So this is very old sort of global economy. And by the 1700s, Ramazzini says chocolate is very, very healthy for scholars. They were careful with drinking, not necessarily teetotalers though. Tissot said tea is terrible, again, a global economic product. Coffee is good, wine is good. He says it's very expeditious and agreeable, but of course, water is really the best. And there's a few more scattered pieces of lifestyle advice. They started to say across these centuries toward the end of this window I'm talking about to go to bed early and get up early. Take a rest after lunch and bathe your head every day, maybe your feet. This is, of course, before people are bathing a whole lot at all. So this is advice that is sort of pushing people to do something I wouldn't otherwise do. And take mineral waters. And Tissot said, it's best if you go to the source of the mineral waters. He said, hypochondriac persons are often cured by visiting remote libraries. That one's for you, Holly, and any library staff here. So you should also keep yourself regular. And as one of my scholars said it, Bacon recommends rhubarb. And when I first read that, I was like, what could that possibly mean? But of course, they mean this guy, Sir Francis Bacon, who had advice, as many other people did, about how scholars should stay regular. It might not work. As Tissot said, you will sometimes see scholars, when nature is quite exhausted by study, fall into a consumption. They might have to lay aside their study, their meditation, their books, and become what men were designed for by nature, plowmen or gardeners. So is it all true? People, when I first was giving this talk, people said, but is it true? And I said, I don't know. But Feijo, one of my scholars, said, it's not true. He said in 1726, I will attempt to ease learning from this burden and demonstrate the common opinion that scholarship is unhealthy to be a general error. The problem is, he said, I know I'm going to fight the world, for all are of a contrary opinion. So his essay, and translated, is called Encouragement for the Professors of Letters, people who profess a scholarly life. It's all going to get worse. Now, why is it going to get worse? Because of the Enlightenment. More people are using human knowledge and reason to solve social problems. So more people are getting educated and, spreading education to others. Also, once we get into the late 1700s, we're seeing the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. That's factory work, more urbanization. So you have more people who work in factories as factory workers as well as managers. They're making goods that women who have the money can buy rather than make. And so now there are women who have more leisure. And so more people are going to be living a sedentary life. And pretty soon, that's going to include more school children, as you have simply more school children. So this has implications for education, and people were already seeing this by the 1690s. One of our famous scholars of education, as well as other things like politics, is John Locke. The book of his that's read less than some of his others, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, which he published in 1693. In that book, he said, children should not be kept inside. They should be sent outdoors and accustomed to cold water and cold air. They should live outside in a more naturalistic way. And you see children's clothing actually change after this book starts to get taken up. They get more open collars and lighter clothes. They're outside more. And children's nurseries get more ventilation. There's all kinds of consequences from this book. As well as Rousseau, about 80 and 70 years later, his book Emile had a lot of the same advice as John Locke, but he added a few elements to it. He also had this kind of romanticizing of childhood, seeing children as these sentimental, tender creatures. He's not alone in that, but it's kind of new in the 1700s and into the 1800s. So he too advised children to spend a lot of time outdoors, but he really saw the outdoors as a study space where you can use outdoor experiences to learn in a very sort of deliberate, planned way. And some people who took up his ideas, Rousseau's ideas and Locke's ideas, were not in either of the places they were, not in England, not in Switzerland, but in fact in what became Germany. And there were some schools made in the late 1700s, inspired especially by Rousseau. And at one of those schools, someone took old Greek gymnastics and modernized it and created something called gymnastics for the more modern age. And those teachers started publishing treatises, thank goodness. So one of them is called Gymnastics for Youth. And the fellow who published that book said very helpfully, talking about the diseases of students, I call this evil the disease of education. So these schools in Germany, inspired by Rousseau, did a lot with outdoor exercise, gardening, nature walks, as well as using kind of this new form of gymnastics, which had its own new equipment, some of which would be actually familiar to us. All right, so all of that's kind of in place by 1800, 1810. Now we're going to go across to the United States. All right, so by the 1800s, a lot of these ideas had been circulating for a long time, and some of the solutions, like those schools in Germany and new kinds of gymnastics. And so people are starting to write more and more about the diseases and disorders that afflicted people who spent too much time at their desks, whether they were office workers or students. So they had books like Disorders of Literary Men, a treatise of desk diseases, a guide to health to promote the health, happiness, and longevity of students, including girls, and the influence of modern physical education on females. And there's quite a few more. So these all came out within a few years of each other, starting around 1825. And they were published in London, published in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, sort of a transatlantic phenomenon. Now we add a new dimension of concern now, and that is what they call consumption. Later is going to be called tuberculosis. It's pulmonary consumption. This disease started spiking in New England after about 1810. It was at a certain point in the 1820s, the leading cause of adult death in the Northeast. It was, though, not seen as contagious. Later, we saw tuberculosis as contagious. Back in the time I'm talking about, they saw it as consumption. They were reading it more by the symptoms, and they didn't see it as a contagious disease. They thought it was a lifestyle disease of people who spent too much time indoors, too much time in sedentary pursuits, in a cold, damp climate. They did notice that it runs in families, and they did tend to believe that someone who had a slim physique, sort of a narrow-chested build, was predisposed to get consumption, kind of mixing up cause and effect, we would say, because it makes you thin, and so they end up having a slim chest, but they seem to think then that you were on the way if you had that build to begin with. So consumption was seen as common among college students, teachers, ministers, writers, and they're worried that younger students, as more and more students get educated, you're going to have more consumption. So that's a problem, because people wanted there to be more consumption, more schooling. There's a big push around the 1820s and 30s to create not just schools, but school systems in the Northeast, starting in the Northeast in particular. And this included not just more children going to school, but attending more regularly for longer terms. The school terms were pretty short then, and staying at it for more years. But if you have more schooling for each child, more children in school, you're going to have more people living this sedentary life, and perhaps more cases of consumption and the other physical and mental ailments that people were concerned about in the sedentary lifestyle. So on top of all of those other hazards, there's this train wreck coming of more school and more disease. So here's the big point of my book in one big slide. The founders of America's public school system, starting around 1830, were aware of these long-held concerns that I've just been reviewing with you about scholarly living. They were newly worried, in addition, about pulmonary consumption. They were aware of how some people in Europe had been experimenting with these health measures in schools, and they were eager to expand schooling if they can do it in a way that blocks and ideally reverses these dangers of the sedentary lifestyle. So their responses to this problem, this dilemma, set up our approach to school health that we have still today. So they did this in 3 ways. I'm getting to gym class, but they actually had 3 different responses. One is teaching what we would call health class. They started putting out hygiene textbooks. There were nearly 50 of these from around 1830 to 1860, written and published in the United States, as well as some imports from Europe. But there was really kind of a surge of these books in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, published in the United States, mostly by MDs. There were also new schoolhouse and school furniture designs, and physicians were taking the lead in advising how to build school buildings, how to lay out the schoolroom, and how to build school furniture. It wasn't about all the other things you could have as priorities in building a schoolhouse: beauty, efficiency, being cheap, good teaching. It was about medical improvement in the school experience. And then also school-based exercise was part of that 3-part response to this dilemma. So this is kind of an aspirational class playground. There weren't too many playgrounds that looked like this. This is from a textbook that was published, one of those hygiene textbooks published in the 1850s. But I'm fascinated by this picture. It's actually my cover photo on Twitter, because there's so many different kinds of exercise being contemplated here. You also see that it's gender segregated, although this boy is trying to see what the girls are doing. Girls don't care what the boys are doing. But there's an awful lot going on here, and lots of different forms of exercise being provided for. Most schools were not as exercise rich as this at the time this book came out. So what kinds of exercise did they have? In that time, there were places where students could do gymnastics. Usually they weren't yet at the school. Before 1860, you didn't have schools with gymnastics equipment like this. A few, but not many. So this is where you would have a gym in the city, like a public gym that people could join, men could join. And gymnastics were considered a very, very masculine experience. That comes partly from the history of gymnastics over in Germany, which would be a sidebar I'd be happy to go into. But there was a teacher in Boston who taught girls, and he wanted girls to do gymnastics, and he had to come up with another name for it. He called it hygiene exercise, and the parents still were not into it. They said, no way, too rough. But someone, perhaps Catherine Beecher, whom some of you may know, she's the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and herself, Catherine Beecher, was a real pioneer in education. She may be the one who coined the term calisthenics. This is from the Greek roots for beauty, the calis part, and strength, the sthenics part. You notice beauty is first in that word. And that's not an accident. Sometimes the exercises that were invented under the heading of calisthenics really did put beauty ahead of physical strenuousness. But this is a way to get girls exercising in schools. So some famous women educators used multiple forms of exercise. There's Catherine Beecher. She used calisthenics in particular. Emma Willard, whose school by that name is still around in Troy, New York, was most interested in using dance. And Mary Lyon, who founded Mount Holyoke Seminary, which later became one of the early colleges for women, used calisthenics and walking and domestic work. Girls there had to walk a mile every day and do calisthenics and do all of the custodial and laundry work and cooking for the school. Early normal schools, that's teacher training schools, joined in and taught their teachers in training all about hygiene and the body and physical exercise. So a lot of early teachers, and we're talking starting in the 1840s, were trained with exercise and health as priorities, even before there were specialized teachers or specialized rooms. So games for girls, and those teachers are some of the ones that spread this, were trying to promote grace and beauty as well as cheerfulness, as well as some sort of athletic attainment. They had this game that was called usually the Graces, or flying hoop. They played battledore and shuttlecock. We would call it, again, badminton, but without a net. That is not really new. Here's a 1740 painting showing a girl with a racket and a shuttlecock. So we know that's not brand new, but it was implemented more in schools. And different kinds of what we would maybe call manual labor were used in schools. This one on the left is from one of those German schools in 1774, and it's a very important picture. It's co-ed already. they're doing some heavy, sort of shoveling, but also making a garden that's kind of formal. So there's a few different things going on in this picture, and it's really pretty worth studying. I haven't seen too many scholars writing about it. But also manual labor could be used in a very different way as a way for vocational training to happen. And that was implemented a lot at schools for Native American children, African American children, boarding schools, Indian boarding schools that were really pretty exploitative, if not very exploitative, orphanages as well. So manual labor is really a mixed blessing at schools as a form of exercise. It's got its own real history. As we go forward in the 1800s, German gymnastics was joined by another form of gymnastics that was developed in Sweden. So the German gymnasts, this became sort of a sport culture thing in Germany. And they used a German word, turnen, that means like turning and flipping. And so they were called turners. As German immigrants were coming, especially in the 1840s and 50s, they would start clubs in their city. So this isn't school-based at all. It ends up blending with schools later. Swedish gymnastics were used more in schools at first. So for a while, schools that wanted to use gymnastics at all had to choose between German gymnastics and Swedish gymnastics. So it's sometimes called the battle of the systems. In Boston, this physical trainer, Diocletian Lewis, working with Catherine Beecher and another fellow, Dudley Sargent, really systematized this for schools. And that's where it really becomes a recognizable form of physical education. So that's where gymnastics becomes something for everyone, boys and girls, and became more formalized for use in schools. All right, so I've got a few threads going on here in this talk. I'm going to take a moment and go away from schools for younger children and talk about colleges for a bit. Men's intercollegiate athletics began in the 1850s in New Hampshire. Some of you know this. The first intercollegiate athletic experience that we really know about is the Harvard-Yale Regatta, which took place on Lake Winnipesaukee in 1852 for the first time. And there was the first college gym, which was built at Amherst College in 1859, and they appointed a fellow, Edward Hitchcock Jr., to be the first physical education professor at the college level at using that gym. So that was a pretty big development. Outside of schools and colleges, along with those Turner clubs, there were men's baseball leagues and even boys playing baseball. This image on the left is from the Boston Common in 1834. So we know that boys were playing a form of baseball that early, if not earlier. But there start to be more formalized men's clubs by the 1840s and 50s playing baseball and really formalizing the rules. All right, some of you are going to say, where's the YMCA? Well, here it comes. The YMCA was founded in London in 1844 and made it over to Boston by 1851. And this is the beginning of what scholars call muscular Christianity. That is, it's an aspect of Christian worship that says your body is a temple, and if you make your body strong and fit, that's doing something that's pleasing to God. And that was a real impetus to more exercise. So the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, really became very established in America, as you probably know. And there were YMCA gyms being built by the late 1860s. It was a YMCA staffer that coined the term bodybuilding, and basketball was invented at a YMCA gym in Springfield, Mass. in 1891. The YMCA was joined by other forms of physical culture, including this magazine, which is a very progressive magazine. This fellow, Bernard McFadden, who put out this magazine, would put these really edgy articles in here, like the truth about women's clothing and love before and after marriage. He's actually talking about premarital sex in this physical culture magazine. So there's a whole sort of other brand of masculinity that's being developed alongside physical and fitness culture. So what's going on with women as there's more and more athletic opportunity in men's colleges and schools? What's going on with women? Well, this book came out in 1873 that said women should not be doing this at all. The book was called Sex in Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls. It was published by a physician who said girls' health takes a nosedive in school. And it was really, again, kind of hydraulic. He said the blood and energy, vital energy is diverted up to their brain when they try to do algebra and away from their ovaries. And so they're not going to be healthy enough to have good children if they can have children at all. This very quickly got kind of social Darwinist and frankly racist. As this author said, we certainly don't want white girls who have opportunities for higher education to be bearing fewer children than people who don't have these opportunities. You see right where that's going. And people started talking openly about this race suicide to allow young women to get more education. Again, awkward timing, because this is just as more of these women's colleges are getting formalized. There's the Morrill Act has led to co-ed universities, and there's more and more opportunity for girls and women to get advanced education, and more women who are teachers and even school principals. So it's kind of too late to say that women should not be getting advanced education. But you'll sometimes see references to this book because there was some talk about it for, maybe a decade or so. I'm going to say, though, that usually those references are overblown. There were more people who responded to that book by increasing the amount of exercise in women's colleges than by taking women out of colleges. So because women's colleges felt sort of charged with this abuse of women's bodies, they really increased their athleticism. Women's colleges became known for being quite athletic. And whereas some men's colleges by then already were starting to have physical education requirements, women's colleges joined in. So you get more and more athletic opportunity for women as a backlash to that book. So Vassar College had this baseball team. This is before women are playing basketball. I've seen this image attributed to two different locations. It's either at Vassar or it's at this high school in Washington, D.C. But either way, shortly after the invention of basketball, women are already playing. This calisthenics class does not look all that strenuous, but we don't know what they did right after this. Women, you can see, are wearing corsets in these images, but they're out there bicycling, they're playing tennis, they're doing more and more sports, at least those who have the means and the time to do it. And the Gibson girl image, which some of you will have heard of in advertising in the early 1900s and the late 1890s, often showed women in sporting situations, and they were elite women, but they were kind of physically attractive and beautiful, and they were sort of known as beautiful. The Gibson girl image was an ideal, and they were not sedentary. They were quite physically active. So there actually was much more support for women being athletic than what we usually think. All right, so after 1900, there's more and more men's college sports. This is a Cornell crew team putting into the river. There was a series of dime novels called about Frank Merriwell, and there were 200 of these books sold. Frank Merriwell was a Yale student who had a body like Tarzan and a head like Einstein. These books were incredibly popular. I love this cover because you see how many different sporting opportunities Frank Merriwell has in this one room. He's fencing, there's gymnastics equipment over here, there's oars for crew over here, more gymnastics equipment, boxing gloves. This guy is very, very physically active, as well as being a genius. Already by the early 1900s, there's danger in sports like in football. Notice right away, these poor fellows have excellent haircuts, but no helmets, and they're not going to come out very well in these football games. There were some really notable and tragic deaths on the football field in 1909 in particular, and there was a response to that. That's when they started using helmets, because they were leather helmets. It helped a bit. They also banned certain moves and certain grips in football and certain practice techniques, but football was already known to be very dangerous. So a lot of times people think, again, that girls' sports just weren't happening at all. But basketball became the most popular team sport for girls and for young women. And there were a lot of basketball teams. There were basketball teams at Y's, including Black Fives, they call them, at a lot of YWCAs and other kinds of amateur leagues. And they even had the Amateur Athletic Union had national basketball tournaments for women starting in the 1920s. It took a little strange turn in 1929 when they started having a beauty queen at the tournament. It also took a strange turn when they invented girls' rules for basketball, which some of you will remember. And it was said out loud that part of the reason for these moves to kind of feminize basketball was the concern that women were not going to be interested in men, that these were not the right kind of women who were involved in sports. And so there was already kind of a policing of sexual identity and sexuality in sport by the early 1900s. So a few schools banned women's basketball, others used girls' rules, others used regular rules and spread women's basketball. So sometimes I'll say, if your relatives in the 50s or you in the 50s didn't play basketball, go back to the 20s and somebody might have been playing, a woman might have been playing basketball, your grandmother, whoever it might be. So women were athletic. They just needed opportunities. That's Babe Didrikson-Zaharias. You may remember her. And there really was more athletic opportunity for women, at least in the 20s, than there came to be later. So let's kind of pull it back into the big picture. By the middle of the 20th century, there was a lot of sport, but not always a lot of fitness. So people would say the US was sports rich and fitness poor. People were very concerned that in World War II, almost half the recruits failed their physical fitness tests. So after World War II, you see more states beginning to require physical education for all students, kind of making it much more universal, much more systematic. Schools themselves had been getting larger, physically larger, architecturally larger since the 20s and building in gyms. So that part's not new, but there's more and more phys ed starting in the 40s and 50s, and the baby boom. So the activities are also changing over time. More and more phys ed gym classes were gender differentiated. In other words, girls and boys do different things, or at least they meet differently, even if they do the same things. And I remember that too, maybe many of you do. And there's all kinds of other politics going on in gym class. For example, Henry Ford in the 1920s promoted square dancing. Square dancing didn't just stick around from a time when everyone did it. This was an active campaign by Henry Ford because he thought that jazz dance styles were degraded. For him, it was not because he thought they came from Black people. He thought they came from Jewish people. Didn't like that. So he wanted to bring back these European folk dances to kind of keep up the European tradition, as he would have put it, in American culture. It's kind of ironic because it was usually Black slave dance callers in the early 1800s who made a lot of the changes in square dance that Henry Ford then promoted as, like, for him, a positively white thing. But in any case, many of us grew up doing square dancing in gym class, and that has got its own little history. So I'm jumping kind of forward a bit and coming more up to today. Trends over the last few decades and up to now. Some of them are negative and some of them are positive in school sport and exercise. So here's a big kind of sweeping wrap up. After World War II, what had been physical training became more about physical education. So instead of getting into gym class and doing a bunch of calisthenics, that's when people started learning the rules to tennis, learning the rules to volleyball, ideally creating lifetime sports activity. But some people said they take gym all the time, but they're not actually in very good shape. Why is that? And it's this constant kind of back and forth between physical training and physical education that there's always somebody who's unhappy with wherever that pendulum is. There were more people failing fitness tests in the 50s, in like Army recruits again. We know that zooming to the end of the century, we started to have a large increase in childhood obesity. And we also know, especially since the year 2000-ish, more emphasis on school testing, high stakes testing and things like reading and math has caused people, the school system sometimes to cut gym, to cut recess, to cut sports, even just cost cutting. Sports are expensive. So there's times that children have had fewer opportunities. And another concern that people have is that youth sports, for those children that do get involved in them, are so professionalized that there is more danger, more injuries, narrower skills. So, for example, some people, and not so much in New Hampshire, but some places kids will play baseball almost year round, and they're using the same baseball muscles all the time and getting kind of baseball injuries or tennis injuries because they go so far with one sport instead of diversifying it. So those are some concerns. There's also a lot of concern among physical educators about just overall insufficient fitness, even more during COVID. So in 2018, this organization put out this report card on physical activity, gave it overall a D-. This report card has not been updated during COVID, but you can imagine it's probably not better than this. So there's just a lot of concern about insufficient school exercise. But there are some positive trends in school exercise, maybe positive. The president's physical fitness test was something that at least caused some activity around the test. That's high stakes testing for PE. That was actually phased out in 2012 in favor of something now called the Presidential Youth Fitness Program. But a lot of people for a lot of time did the president's physical fitness tests. My two children did it. One of them set a school record and was collected as patches and was way into it. The other one, it was like the worst day of the year. So, I'd be happy to hear your stories about that. More people perhaps, and I've read about this online quite a bit, have traumatic memories. And here's just one that I collected from someone who wrote about it online. Sit and reach. I sat, I reached, I farted, ruined 5th grade. So there's lots of stories about the president's physical fitness test. And again, I'd be happy to hear yours. From 1972, when Title IX was passed, it became illegal to exclude girls from athletic opportunity. It covers a lot of situations in education besides sports, by the way, but it certainly covers sports. And this led gradually to more athletic opportunity for girls. It doesn't have to be exactly 50-50. There's some misconceptions about the way Title IX is applied, but it did bit by bit lead to more athletic opportunity for girls. And I was a beneficiary of that myself. There was a phase for a while of what was called new games, and some of that's still around, just maybe not with the label, more cooperative games versus competitive games. There was a genuine lifetime sports movement. I don't think it's really gone, but it's kind of less the emphasis. And then more in the last 25 years or so as a wellness paradigm is kind of more holistic. And this too is where PE and health class sometimes kind of merge. And I would call all of these very often positive trends. A lot of regular classrooms are also doing very innovative things to keep kids more physically fit. So they're putting sometimes exercise bikes or standing desks in classrooms, or using big exercise balls, and just integrating physical movement with all other kinds of education, which I think is generally a positive thing. So there's some trends in adult sports too, and this is really my last thing. Some negative and some positive, and this comes from before COVID, but obviously COVID doesn't help. There's fewer bowling leagues and workplace softball teams. You're probably aware of that. More adult obesity for sure, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, all kinds of things that go along with that. A lot more sedentary living. We're all, again, so much on our screens, so much seated, so much indoors, things that are automated, kind of take some of the physical work out of things that we do. I just got a stand mixer. Baking is now easier for me physically. Maybe that's not such a good thing, although I'm delighted to have it, I got to say. So, this is a trend that is not necessarily heading in the direction of physical fitness. But there are also positive trends in sport and exercise. More workplace wellness programs, more running and triathlons, step counters. I'm wearing my Fitbit right now. We have lots of people who are seniors of any age who are taking exercise classes. And we know a few things and do a few things better. I think we're better about bathing and our teeth, maybe our diets, not so sure about sleep. But, we do learn from our mistakes some. And there are lots of ways that people try to make our sedentary lifestyle more physically fit. Treadmill desks, exercise bike desks, lots of ways we try to keep ourselves from having to choose between moving and being on a screen. So a few takeaways. Not all of our health fears and health fads are going to stick around. Like, we're not that worried about eating sparrows anymore or eels. But the concerns about a sedentary life or a scholarly life making people sick are very old and not really going away. The public school system, I always want people to know, included care for the whole child, for the child's body from its early years as being a system. That's not a frill. It's not a new retrofit onto a previously all academic enterprise. And all of these things, exercise, health, and diet knowledge, trying to make seats and desks more ergonomic and buildings healthier, are time-honored pursuits and necessary pursuits, because we all now live like scholars. So that is my show, and I will stop sharing my screen and hope to get some questions and comments from you. Worst day of the year, Holly, for you too. So thanks so much. And I'd be happy to take any questions if you want to unmute yourself and fire away, or put a question in the chat.
I think you answered all our questions so well.
Holly, did anybody send direct message questions
I
to you?
did have a question from Valerie about, the difference in boys and girls, but you ended up answering it during your program. So, yeah.
I rescinded my question.
Oh, thank you. Well, honestly, that's a much longer. I've got a longer answer in me if you're interested, but I'll take it as answered unless you want to refine it.
I just thought it was really interesting that they were looking back in the 1830s at sort of physical fitness being a bad thing. And I wondered if there was a difference between how it was viewed for girls and how it was viewed for boys. And then I realized that probably a lot of girls weren't in school to begin with back then. So I don't know. I'd love to know more about that though.
Yeah, so that's a great kind of thing to put forward. In the 1830s, so the hard part about talking about education is that the clock of when things happen in education, the timeline, is completely different from one place to the next. The most advanced state for education was Massachusetts. By the 1830s in Massachusetts, in the summer, schooling wasn't like September to June, it was summer and winter. The fall and spring usually didn't have school. Summer teachers were more often women than men in Massachusetts by the 1830s. So there's enough women getting enough school that they can then serve as teachers already by then. And people starting to worry about girls' fitness as well along with it. In fact, in France, back in the 1700s, there were boarding schools for girls that were so worried about girls' posture and their physical fitness that they had all these contraptions like neck braces and even mechanical beds that would stretch them out at night. And I've heard that sometimes girls would actually be locked into these mechanical beds. I've got some ghoulish pictures. I don't have them in this talk. Be locked into these mechanical beds at night so that their spines would be straightened. Horrible thought. And there were pantaloons, special kind of pantaloons long before the bloomer costume for doing exercises in French boarding schools by the 1780s and 90s. So this really does go a ways back. Yeah, definitely more privileged girls. Exactly. But sometimes the privileged girls are in schools that test things out that then get more mainstream as they get cheaper. So I don't want to leave things out just because it's an elite of kids, because sometimes that's where you see the leading edge, right? A lot more thing. Exactly. Thanks for these nice thoughts. So the JFK program in the early 60s, yeah, that's one that I want to learn a lot more about. Tim Dolan, do you want to say what you know about it, and I'll add on what I know? Unless we've forcibly muted him. There we go.
Am I here?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I don't really know much about it other than I participated in it.
Oh, did
And there
you?
was
What
a
do you
big-
remember?
It was I remember we made a special effort to ensure that we got gym time. And I can't really think, I know we had a lot of playground games, which I think would be normal for anyone, I think, but they made a big deal out of, making sure that you know, not so much lost weight, but kept fit.
Yeah.
So I
Were,
Go
were
ahead.
boys and girls separated in your gym classes?
I don't know. I don't remember. I also went to a parochial school, so that would add a little bit different, additional dimension.
Right.
But I really don't remember much about it. I mean, I was, I forget when he died in '63, so I don't know. I don't know if he started it in 1960 when he came in, or what exactly.
So the president's physical fitness test was from after JFK, but it was definitely part of that kind of growth in let's actually solve this problem. There's a lot of kind of concerns, like, belly aching and discussion of that problem in the 50s and the 40s and 50s. And so by the 60s, and I think JFK was a big spur to this, people were saying, let's actually improve physical fitness. But 66 is after JFK. So it's kind of, he started it and there was some momentum after he left. I'm gonna go ahead and mute you again though, if you don't mind. That's great. Tim, you can definitely unmute and come back in if you want, but I tend to mute people if there's background noise and they're not, talking right then. Anybody else? Elaine? Yeah.
Yeah, I graduated in '65, so I was taking gym class before that. I hated it. I hated those bloomers we had to wear. We were separated, boys and girls, and every month we had to do something different. And I can remember basketball, they would only allow the girls to play half court. They didn't think we were capable of playing the whole court. And I thought it was so pointless because when we were outside on our own, we played with the boys at the playground and we played a full court and we did other activities. And I thought going to gym one day a week for 1 hour is not doing what they think it's accomplishing when we're doing a lot more on our own and you won't let us do more.
Right. Or what damage could be done by actually letting you run up and down the court in 1 hour a week. And do you remember having to take foul shots underhand?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
And to this day, I cannot hit a basket overhand.
See, it stunted your athleticism. That's really not fair.
My grandchildren, my granddaughters, all of them played basketball, could play it well. They eventually got into field hockey and lacrosse, but I would try to play with them in their yard and I could never make a basket because I had never learned how.
Yeah, that's just terrible. Chris Washko, you have yourself unmuted. Do you have a memory or a question?
Well, one thing that really frustrated me was that you run as fast as you can and then you get to the half court and you had to stop.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised that more girls didn't get injured,
Yeah, that's true.
One thing this is in New York State, by the way, and they seem to have a big emphasis on gym class and all. You were required to go. They marked you off. If you showered, you were in trouble if you didn't. And I just didn't understand how we'd ever have time to exercise and shower and go back to class. It was too disruptive, I thought. What was the other thing? I just loved it when about, I don't know, was it a sophomore, junior? Us girls got dancing, modern dancing.
Oh.
So I was really good with that. And I actually did a solo at the gym show. So that was pretty
There was
cool.
a gym show?
Oh, every year. And my two brothers, by the way, were the champions of walking on their hands. They would follow each other, walking on their hands around the perimeter of the whole gym. They were very athletic, but that's all they could show in the gym show.
Wow. So what else was in the gym show? I'm fascinated. I don't think I've ever heard of this. This is great.
There was one boy that was, I don't know what level he was at, but he was a champion sit-up guy. So he'd show us, and I couldn't believe how fast he was doing them. I thought you had to go all the way back down and then up and down and up. No, here, bam, 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 bam. And
Wow.
yeah, and the guys, I think there was a little bit of basketball. It had to be indoor sports.
So is this like a thing at night that parents would come to?
Yeah, once a year. Yeah, once a year they would come and they would sit there, and you reminded me of how distinctly it bothered me that I'm doing this modern dance thing. I'm the only person on the gym floor, and I look up at my father, and he's looking off the other way. I was so mad. At least he came, though. It wasn't like him to even join in, but he came.
Wow.
I should add that my mother was very athletic, and she ran the girls softball team in the summer.
When was that? Do you remember when that was?
1965, 66.
Yeah, that's great.
So
So
that
you
was a
guys are
big thing.
in, what's that?
I'm just saying it was a big thing in my family.
Oh, yeah. So you're from a pretty athletic family, sounds like.
Yeah, I'm the
Yeah.
least athletic of all of them.
Oh, Lauren Heberly forged your parents' signature to be allowed to participate in wrestling. That's
Oh,
fantastic. I was about to talk about the horrible uniform that I had to wear at one of the schools I went to, but I want to hear about that. Lauren, do you mind?
Yeah, I'll try. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, they had this, you'd have 2 weeks of X type of extra activity that you were learning or whatever, and 2 weeks of something else. And the girls were being assigned to gymnastics and the boys were assigned to wrestling. And I didn't want to do gymnastics. And so I asked permit, that the coach said I had to have permission from my parents. And so they wouldn't give it to me, surprisingly. Isn't that funny? I mean, you knew them.
I did. Yeah, Lawrence and old friend. I am really surprised, actually. Wow.
Yeah, so I forced their signature and did it anyway.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was fun.
2 weeks is a really short rotation. What are you even going to
Isn't it?
learn in 2 weeks?
Yeah, I know.
Point of that. Wow. So this has been such a nice chat. So I went to a bunch of different schools, and at one of them we had these horrible polyester jumpsuits that were one piece. Whose dumb idea was that? You know what's going to happen. You have to go to the bathroom. The whole thing's going to come off. It was terrible. And it was this very, very thick polyester. So it was super uncomfortable if you got the slightest bit sweaty. Like, I don't like, I'm kind of pro gym class in general, I think, but those uniforms were not well chosen. I'm sure they were probably the cheapest or something. So other questions or memories? Oh, you were in high school in Title IX. Yeah. So that's interesting. Very interesting, Ruth Ellen, that people would go to co-ed gym classes because of Title IX, because I don't know that Title IX requires that. I've not ever known that. So did they stay with co-ed gym classes, or did they go back to single sex after a while?
I think they stayed with the co-ed. It was my junior and senior year, but it was just interesting, the controversy. And that's how the school interpreted, because that's what we were told. Oh, we have to do it. It's Title IX. But just like they have the mask issues at schools and the school board, it was all about co-ed gym. And I would say 75% of the girls just didn't show up, and the teachers just passed them along because they didn't want to bother with the controversy.
Wow. Oh no, you got warts from the showers. That's horrible. Honestly, the showers that was kind of a phenomenon too. I mean, I remember that a little bit myself.
well, our showers were one gigantic room. And all
Right.
of us would go in there naked and shower, and I don't know, you felt very self-conscious. You weren't really going to take a shower.
Yeah.
That was just weird,
Yeah. That's asking a lot of kids in high school.
Yeah.
It's one thing if you're on a sports team and it's not required, but if it's a required class,
Mhm.
yeah.
They had separate area, two little areas where a girl could get permission to go in there and change her clothes by herself and shower by herself and all. So you could get some privacy. And having your period was one of the reasons that you could get permission.
So then everybody knows you have your period.
Yeah. But we didn't make a big deal out of it, but.
Valerie, that's a very good point about the gym. In one of my gym classes, the same one where we wore the terrible uniform, we had a calisthenics unit and we would do leg lifts. And the gym teacher said, and the way she said it was so strange. She said, if you are in your period, don't do the leg lifts. Why? Why? She never really explained why. Just if you are in your period, don't do the leg lifts. And so there were always some girls sitting it out looking extremely self-conscious because now everybody in the class knows who has their period. It's like now we would say like really kind of an invasion of privacy. I hope we would say that we shouldn't really be like revealing things like that about kids and like forcing them to reveal it. And, I'm sure there were lots of kids who just pretended they never had their period so that they didn't have to like spill the beans or something. But it was interesting to think about privacy issues around gym class because there were some boundaries that were different, I think, at the time.
I don't remember, can I say something? I don't remember a ton about my elementary gym. I remember, I think, being more fun. But in high school, I wish I had a better experience because our coach was like the school's coach. I went to a small school, was also the gym teacher. And he would basically punish the whole gym class when the sports team didn't do well. And we would be running and things like that. Or if they had got caught doing something they weren't supposed to. And so some of the star players had to sit out. That's how my gym class was. So yeah, it was pretty bad.
That really is kind of a mixing of the sports team and the gym class.
Yeah, it was sort of an extension of his, I think, sports team is how I felt like gym class was. So
yeah,
I've
heard some weird stories like that. Like the high school football coach teaches the gym class and makes everybody fold the football team's uniforms or something like that. But I don't know if those stories are real. You know what I mean? Like that sounds so extreme. So I've never quite been sure. Maybe I've just slandered a generation of football coaches. That was not unfair, but that doesn't seem like something that ought to cross.
Right.
Yeah, Valerie, that's a really good point. Like, why is gym class so traumatizing? Does it have to be? And honestly, if someone could solve that nut, that would really be a huge public service. And I think there have been places that have tested out yoga and meditation and some other things that, maybe the first day doesn't go as well. And after a while, maybe it does. I don't know. This is honestly, I'm a historian. So when I come into the present day, I'm a little bit on thin ice. Like this is not the thing I know about the most, but I'm always happy when people bring in information that I don't have because, there's a lot to know and maybe there's good stuff going on beyond what I've heard about.
I'm just
I'd
gonna
like to
say-
speak up if you don't mind. I might have been one of the people you love to hate, but I was a phys ed teacher.
No, I'm so happy. I'm always happy
okay.
when phys ed teachers come to this.
And I did it for the first 10 years of my career. Before Title IX, I was teaching in a very nice junior high school, large junior high school, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. I used to run after school sports programs. I had 2 whole teams of junior varsity and varsity kids, girls. And I got the buses, I got the referees on my free period. They paid me an intramural fee. So I was well underpaid compared to the men teachers who had after school teams. They had somebody else got their buses, somebody else got their referees, somebody else made their schedule. I did all of this on my free period. And finally, when some of the townspeople saw what I was doing, some of the mothers came in after school to help me. And they got nothing. Okay, so this went on until Title IX. Title IX, I went to my before Title IX, I went to my athletic director, who was my boss, and I said, well, one of my bosses went for when I coached. The principal was my boss for phys ed classes. And I said, you know, I do all this work. I carry twice the number of girls that the men carry, and you're not paying me as much. And he went around and told everybody in the school what an aggravation I was. Yeah, so it wasn't pretty. And then what we did was, there were 3 teachers, because we had a large 3 women teachers when we were separated. We did yoga. We taught them orienteering. We took them out, we set a course, and we actually taught them orienteering. We taught them, I actually, let's see, we did cross-country skiing. We told them how to, because it was snow, you know, we did that in the winter, as well as volleyball. When we had volleyball, we taught them the skills, and we had a little tournament at the end. And then the teacher that I was teaching with, because we had huge classes, and I would play the winning team. So there was 2 against 6, and we always beat them, and they went nuts. So, I mean, I coach basketball, I coach field hockey, I coach gymnastics, and I coach softball. And then bad news about Title IX is we then got co-ed classes, and then we had to work with the men phys ed teachers. We all left teaching. Yep.
That's
Within
terrible.
3 or 4 years, we couldn't stand it anymore. It was horrendous, their attitude. So yeah, we had a good run. We taught kids skills that they could use for the rest of their lives. And I understand the time frame. I went through phys ed college, right? So I was always running around like an idiot trying to get changed in time and shower, blah, blah, blah. And I did that at UMass Amherst. You know how huge that campus is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I get it, but I'm still athletic till today. It was, you know, I love sports, I love nature, I love being outside, and I don't regret any of it, but I couldn't stand it because of what happened. And then what happened when they started to pay the women equal with the men, they could consolidate teams. And guess who got those jobs? The men.
Right.
The men.
Wow, that is
So,
unintended consequences, surely.
Yeah, so that's the other side of the story. So you can add that into little history.
Thank you. That's really important. Thank you so much. And I didn't mean to sound so negative about gym class.
No,
Honestly.
I know, I get it.
Yeah.
I only could go to the halfway line when I was in 6th grade, and I knew it was, I went through, but I loved phys ed. I loved being active, and I was lucky because I went to a really nice high school where they had a lot. I was on the gym team, gymnastics team, and I played other sports, and it was, so I had a better experience than most. But I get it. I knew it was a hassle. And then when we went co-ed, we had to actually bring in what we decided to do. We had to talk the men into it. But, you know, when you have 7th graders and 9th graders, you could have a kid that weighs 65 pounds and somebody weighs 250 pounds. You cannot have them in the same class in a physical situation when it's active and aggressive, you know, and competitive. So we had to talk the men teachers into doing a Scott motor ability test. So it had to do with your speed, your fitness, your general coordination. And then, so then we had 4 groups of meeting, and then we had the kids that were small and maybe not so fast, not so heavy, or they just hated gym. They'd end up in the lower classes because they didn't try real hard. But then you would have the other kids where you would have a class where they were all like kids that were playing sports after school and highly aggressive. And I ended up teaching a class of 8th grade boys, and I was the only female in the room. Okay, you try to keep them off the walls. It was quite a challenge. I ran those guys like crazy because they needed it and they wanted it, and it was the only way to keep anybody sane. So, you know, I get it. I get it. So that's a little more history for you that you didn't know.
That's fantastic. I'm always thrilled when gym teachers come to these talks, and I've had some, and it just gives so much more dimension than I can possibly do because I've never had that job. And you lived it. You just did exactly the things that we were talking about and so much more. So I think that's incredibly helpful.
I'm excited, you know, that the girls have really good sports teams in high school and in, in college. And that colleges are held accountable to, try to give women, girls, young women, equal amount of funding. But when
Yeah.
when they're big football schools, you're never going to get that. But
Right.
it's much
Well,
better
yeah.
than it was.
It is better. I was on our athletic council at Plymouth State for a while, and so I know how there are different paths to compliance with Title IX. You don't have to have exactly equal funding or exactly equal number of people, which is helpful because a football team can have 80 students on it, and they're not women. So it's more fluid and flexible than most people know, but it is a little bit tricky to keep from just putting all the money into football because it is such a expensive sport. So we should probably wind it down, right, Holly? Because people are going to start to need to go, or what is your thinking about the timing?
Yeah, if anyone has any more questions, if they want to ask them now or chat. I know a couple people have left so far, but. And yeah, when Marjorie mentioned cross country skiing, we did that in gym. I remember that was like my favorite thing. We would go across the street into the cemetery, and we were allowed to be independent and ski there. And I texted my grandmother was a basketball star, and like, it must have been the 40s. I texted her while we were doing this, and she told me that she's 90 or almost 90 now. And she said gym was her favorite class. So
excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I was a runner, so I used to take my gym class running around town.
Oh, that's excellent.
And I created a board game on nutrition. And it was a marathon. It was 26 miles, and I had a board game. So, on the longer classes, I had them learn about nutrition and training and good thing. They'd have to answer questions and stuff to actually complete the marathon. That was to kind of supplement running, so.
That's fantastic.
We had a good time until we didn't.
I'm so sorry that you were pushed out of the profession, though. That's like a terrible
A lot of
sort
women.
of epilogue. Yeah.
Yeah, I went into corporate America and I made a whole lot more money.
I wish I could have had her gym class back in the 60s.
You would have
Yeah,
loved
really. It sounds terrific.
No.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
No, thank you so much for telling us all about that. That was just wonderful.
Well, thank you guys all for
Thank
coming.
you.
I will send out an email tomorrow, probably with the recording and some links to our other programs. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for coming tonight. It was great.
Thanks all of you.
Have a good
Yes,
This was
night.
a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.